semester we did like morning to night kind of walk, but that professor was really nice. Yeah, it was like nice out. It was really pretty. So we did that. I think Monday when we had our day off, I went to the botanical gardens and the zoo. Because we had to do like a couple outings for like class credit. So we did that. That was fun. I haven't been to years. Another thing are the lights at night. They're doing something at Nationals Park. They're doing like a Christmas like shop land thing on the field where there's like ice skating and lights and amenities and everything. So I think they're cool. Before we leave. So we won't make it for Christmas. I know. I wish it was That'd be so nice. Oh my god. If we just graduated.
My schedule next semester is insane. You know, I'm like on Hey, how are you? But I'm only supposed to use it like every 6 hours, but it's like really like short. It's like a steroid. It's like if you use it too much, it can seize up your levels.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Maureen Conway. I'm Vice President for Policy Programs here at the Aspen Institute and Executive Director of the Economic Opportunities Program. And I am really delighted to welcome you all to what is our first, what I'll call regular event in our Opportunity America conversation series. We formally launched it last month with sort of a whole afternoon of programming, and today is really the kind of the first day in the what will be an ongoing conversation series. And the purpose really of this series is really to talk about what I will call a crisis of opportunity in the United States today. Really, there are just far too many people who are working hard, either working in a job or starting a business or doing a combination of many of them, and feeling like they're just not making it, right? So we really do have a crisis of opportunity, looks different in different places, and we also know that, you know, sort of race, ethnicity, gender, and place play an outsized role in how people are experiencing this crisis of opportunity. So our purpose is to really talk about this, but also to lift up strategies for improving access to high-quality economic opportunities, and to discuss ideas for generally building a robust economy that will really work for all. At the Economic Opportunities Program, we explore a wide range of strategies that contribute to closing the opportunity gap. We look at ideas for supporting entrepreneurship and business ownership, for improving the quality of jobs available to lower-income workers, strategies that can connect workers to opportunity to learn and to grow in their careers, and a variety of other work to really connect people to opportunity. We see how these strategies play out and how they are shaped by local contexts, by public policy, local institutions, business cultures, and more. And our work often brings us to communities that are on the unfortunate side of today's economic divides. So we really need to take seriously questions not only of sort of the standard economic production numbers that we often follow and market efficiency, but also questions of economic distribution and economic inclusion. Our inattention to the latter questions has really left both our economy and society diminished. So today we struggle with an economy that is by many measures successful, but yet still leaves many feeling left out. One thing that recently struck me was this survey report that Gallup released, noting that less than half of working people in the U.S. report that they are in good jobs. And in particular, they noted that the connection between how people thought about the quality of their jobs and how people thought about the quality of their lives. And I think about that because I think it's an important reminder that these economic numbers have human consequences and really are important to how we live. And so that brings me to why I so appreciate the book that is at the center of today's conversation. So the book, if you didn't see it, The Making of a Democratic Economy, Building Prosperity for the Many, Not Just the Few. It is on sale just out there. I recommend it. The book starts with putting people at the center of and service of societal values as the purpose of our economy. And then it explores what kind of economic system would move towards greater fulfillment of our human aspirations. Too often we forget that the economy is a human system, and a successful economy is not an end in itself, but rather a means toward broader goals. So today we keep that purpose in mind, and today we are thrilled to have Marjorie Kelly here as one of the authors of this book. So we're going to start with framing remarks from Marjorie, giving a little overview of the book and how she came to write it. And then we'll move into a panel discussion, which really is terrific because it gives us the opportunity with two people who've been have long experience working here in the DC metro area to really ground our conversation in the place where we are. So that's a really excellent opportunity. I invite everybody to, while we're having this conversation, join in our online conversation through Twitter using our hashtag #TalkOpportunity. But if you are in the room, we are live streaming, so please do silence your phones. I also want to thank our supporters for this conversation series. We couldn't do it without their support and their partnership. Many thanks to Walmart.org, the Ford Foundation, and Prudential Financial for their longstanding support of the series. And I now am going to turn the podium over to Marjorie to start things off. And I'm not going to do long introductions of our speakers. You have bios in your materials, and I do encourage you to look at them. They all are terrific and amazing people. But what I do want to say about Marjorie is not only is she incredibly accomplished in all the ways that her bio describes, but she's also a longstanding friend of the Institute. She and the Democracy Collaborative not only partner with us at the Economic Opportunities Program, they also work with our colleagues Janet Topolsky at the Community Strategies Group and Judy Samuelson at the Business and Society Program. So we're really thrilled to have Marjorie here, and I welcome you.
Well, thanks, Maureen. And thanks to all of you for coming out on this cold day. Oh, my goodness. I came in from Boston, and I think I must have brought the weather with me. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, it's exciting to be here and to talk about the making of a democratic economy. If I could sum it up in a phrase, what we're trying to do with this book, my co-author Ted Howard and I would say what we need is here. And we don't hear that a lot. I mean, I think there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of pain and sort of chaos, I think, in how we think about our economy and our world today, but quietly growing all over. And the work of the Aspen Institute is doing this. We travel around the country and visit places that are growing a democratic economy. We have some wonderful people here today from Wakefield, from Fairfax County, building community wealth. So there are brilliant people all over, and including, I'm sure, many in this room, building what it is that we need. A new kind of economy is taking shape. I've been covering it for a couple of decades as a journalist, and I would say it really amounts to a new paradigm. We have this idea that our economy is either corporate capitalism or state socialism, and we think it's binary. But really, there's this democratic economy is growing. It's designed for all of us. And what Ted and I do in the book is we talk about what are the principles that are at the core of this, because humans self-organize around things that we care about. So what are the things that we care about that are really at the heart of this democratic economy? And the first is community, right? That we're in this together. And my colleagues and I at the Democracy Collaborative had the great good fortune to work with some Native American leaders on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. And we opened the book with this story, which is where my work at the Collaborative began. And we work with Nick Tilson, who is Oglala Sioux young person, and helped revive traditional spiritual practices on Pine Ridge, some of which had been actually illegal in prior decades. And he and some other young people began to do spiritual ceremonies, and he says they got a message from the elders. And the elders was, how long will you allow others to determine the fate of your children? Are you not warriors? And out of this, they decided to form the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. They're building a regenerative community. It's going to create its own power, solar power, going to recycle its water. They're creating youth skills who are learning construction while they're building homes. And it's a remarkable example of what we call community wealth building. Nick is the kind of person who could have gone off and said, I'm going to be a millionaire. And he didn't. He said, I want to work for the benefit of my community. And that's a very different principle at your heart than, for example, the entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley who are out to make themselves billionaires and don't notice that 1 out of 3 children in their own neighborhoods are going to bed hungry at night. So we see here 2 different kinds of sensibilities, 2 different kinds of economies in operation. One is a democratic economy that's designed for all of us to flourish. The other is an extractive economy, and it's designed to extract maximum wealth for a tiny elite. So community, that's really at the core of a democratic economy. Another is sustainability. We see it in the regenerative community. Ecological sustainability is at the heart of the regenerative community being built there. Another is inclusion. We at the Democracy Collaborative are very excited to begin working with WACF, and Harold will be joining us on the podium today, or I suppose. Yes, I guess that is actually a podium. This is a lectern. That's a podium. I've learned this over the years. And wanting to build, looking at should they be building a center for employee ownership at the city level that would be particularly aimed at helping people of color. We think that's a tremendously exciting project. And, we know that our current economy has been built on the backs of people of color. And so as we're building a democratic economy, we need to put the disadvantaged and people of color at the bullseye. That needs to be at the very heart of what we're doing. So, and I want to also emphasize that I'm sure that most of you probably know WACF, which is renowned here in the DC area. It's a CDFI, a community development financial institution. And so it's using the power of capital to create community wealth and community good. And we are doing some research at the Democracy Collaborative. We believe that capital could be the missing agent that could take employee ownership to scale. So this is an example. So we're talking about community, sustainability, inclusion. And what I want to also emphasize is that there's a role for all of us in this work in building a democratic economy. It's not about us versus them. I mean, capital has a big role to play in this, which I think is very powerful. A couple of other principles. One is democratic ownership. Maureen talked about how all the challenges that our economy faces and how many people are being left out. One of the more remarkable statistics that Ted and I often talk about on our book tour is the fact that 47% of Americans cannot put together $400 in an emergency. That is just shocking. I mean, you think about how many reasons could there be to need $400? Your child breaks an ankle. Your car breaks down. The average car repair costs about $400. You need a band uniform. There are a million reasons you would need $400, and that almost half of us don't have even that, I think is terrifying. I think that's pretty much the definition of financial anxiety and terror. And so, as one economic development leader said to us, it takes a job to get out of poverty. It takes assets to stay out of poverty. And this is some of the really powerful work that I did with Janet Topolsky and some other friends of Aspen. We did some WealthWorks, a WealthWorks project a number of years ago. But it's all about building assets and institutions. That's the work of the democratic economy. It's very different than social safety nets or regulations, which are kind of wrapped around the economy as it is, where the 1% owns everything. And then we try to restrain its activities with these social safety nets and regulations, and it's like barnacles on the side of a whale, right? It doesn't. What we need is a democratic economy, these principles to be in the DNA. We need to get into the DNA of the beast, and that's ownership. Who owns the assets really determines the shape and the power of every economy. So getting assets broadly owned, also redefining the creation of assets. So it's not just about me, it's about community. So democratic ownership, that's another key principle of a democratic economy. And I would add place. We at the Democracy Collaborative do a lot of work with anchor institutions, which are large nonprofit, hospitals, universities that are anchored in place. They're not going to get up and leave like a lot of, as we know, multinational corporations do. And can they use the power of place? Can they bring their purchasing, their hiring, their investing into a place? And we have found that place is a particular value that will bring strange bedfellows together. I've seen some very large corporations wanting to help their local communities because they care about Cleveland, they care about DC, they care about Newark, and so you will have people coming together around a shared concern for place. I will say we're trying to grow this power of place and the power of anchors. We have a large network of nonprofit hospitals. We have a network of anchor collaboratives that are working locally, and I'm thrilled to say that recently our hospital anchor network recently had a number of these large hospitals come together and pledge 1% of their portfolios for place-based impact investing. It's leveraging about $400 million for the benefit of place. So again, there's a role for all of us in building the democratic economy, and it does cohere. This is a new paradigm. This is a way to organize an economy. And again, I think that what we need is here. So we're going to join our other panelists here, and I just want to say that in closing, that I think a key aim that Ted and I have in this book, and that all of my colleagues here at Democracy Collaborative share, is that this can be the next economic system. We want to encourage all of us to dream big and to take ourselves seriously as agents of history, that we really can be the next system. And I think that's the work that we're all engaged in. So thank you. While I'm here at the lectern and still have a second, can I just ask my colleagues at the Democracy Collaborative to raise your hands if you're here? Yeah, great. Some of my fellow colleagues doing this work. Thanks.
Great, thank you. That was terrific. So now I'm welcoming you to the podium. Is that correct? We always called it a riser. But I welcome you and the panelists to the podium. I will do a brief, as they are taking their seats, I'll do a brief names to faces introduction, just so you know. We just heard from Marjorie. Next to Marjorie is Carla Bruce, Chief Equity Officer, Fairfax County Government. Next to Carla is Harold Pettigrew, who's Executive Director of WAKEF. And moderating today's conversation is my colleague Joyce Klein, the Director of our Business Ownership Initiative. So Joyce, I turn over to you.
Thank you. And I'd like to add my welcome to Maureen's. Thanks for joining us today at the Aspen Institute. As Maureen mentioned, I direct the part of the Economic Opportunities Program that focuses on expanding economic opportunity through business ownership. And I was really happy when I got to be the one who moderated today because the themes in the book and the principles that Marjorie and Ted lift up connect very closely to a lot of the themes and the work that we're engaged in the Business Ownership Initiative. Maureen mentioned at the beginning, I think that that in the work that we do at EOP, we're very focused on the issues that race and place and gender play in who accesses opportunity and the quality of opportunity that they're able to access. And for us at the Business Ownership Initiative, we focused a lot on what are the particular issues and challenges that women and people of color and people in certain communities face when they're looking to start or grow businesses. So that's one way in which we connect, is that focus on place and that focus on inclusion. A second thing is the way we work is we work a lot with community organizations that are working in communities to provide capital and access to resources to entrepreneurs who are trying to start and grow businesses. So we work a lot with community development financial institutions, which Marjorie referenced, which are really focused on this issue and this principle of inclusive finance and inclusive capital. And you'll hear more about the work of CDFIs from Harold. And then the third thing is we've been doing a lot of work recently trying to lift up the work that folks like Democracy Collaborative and others are doing to expand employee ownership. As a way to help both individuals to access and build assets and share wealth more broadly, but also because it's a really important way, we find, of improving job quality, because there is evidence that employee-owned firms have higher levels of job quality, which is a key piece of the work we do at EOP. So it's terrific to be able to sort of connect to all those themes in today's conversation. So where I wanted to start is by bringing in first Harold and Carla into the conversation. Marjorie and Ted note in the book that what they're really trying to do is sort of lift up and knit together work that's happening on the ground in many communities to build this new kind of economy. And so what we wanted to do with the panel today and this conversation was to bring in folks who are working locally here in the DC region to do just that and have you get a sense of how the ideas and principles that Marjorie and Ted talked about are really playing out locally. So that's what Harold and Carla are here to do for us today. So I'm going to start with Harold, have him share a little bit about the work of WAKEF, which is the Washington Area Community Investment Fund, but you go by WAKEF.
That is correct.
And WAKEF is an organization that really exists because of this idea that we need to create an economy that works for everyone and that brings people in. So talk to us a little bit about the work of WAKEF, and then also a little bit, because you've been doing this work before you got to WAKEF, just why do you think this kind of new economy is important in terms of the work you're doing now, but why is it important to you personally?
Absolutely. And thank you, Joyce, and it's truly a pleasure to be here. It's a timely conversation. And this is where, for us as an organization, WAKEF has been around for 32 years, really promoting and driving equity and economic opportunity throughout the region. And I had the pleasure of joining the team roughly 4 years ago. And what we decided was we have a wonderful history, but we can't rest on that. We know that the issues that we face right now are clear and they're present. And that for us as an organization, we needed to revisit our mission, our purpose, our vision, our values. And so we set this path forward that will drive us for the next 30 years. That's focused on inclusive entrepreneurship, community wealth building, and equitable economic development. And the wonderful thing as well about the book, Marjorie, is that our very first mission in 1987 called for a democratic economy.
Oh, no, lovely. That's great.
And I was taking a look back before the panel just to refresh my notes and memory and things. And there was a very bold vision very early on about what this organization could and should stand for. And so we embraced that, thinking through how as an organization we can continue on our path to expose and create pathways to entrepreneurship. And we hit on some of the points, right? The reason why is because entrepreneurship is that second most powerful pathway to building wealth. And that's what we're in the business of. Asset building for the purpose of wealth creation so that our communities can thrive. And so we looked back at our history, understood many of the challenges that we're dealing with now, specifically the racial wealth gap, and thinking through the barriers that we have in our region. What that led us to was developing 3 pillars of how we organize our work. The first being inclusive entrepreneurship, the second being community wealth building, the third being equitable economic development. We provide capital. We're a CDFI, as mentioned earlier, but even more than that, we're an impact organization. Our goal was to begin thinking through ways that we can use the tools we have available to us to embrace the full potential of what our mission calls for. And so we're developing more capital tools. Last year, and my colleague here, Jennifer Bryant, is leading this work. Last year, we launched an employee ownership initiative because we wanted to expand the pathways by which people could be exposed to entrepreneurship. And so that's kind of the framing at which we're here today. And so for us, it's making sure that we expand those pathways, that we use capital as well to help influence those pathways. But for me, it's a bit personal because this is home. I'm a native Washingtonian, and for the history of this city, as with many of our cities around the country, we know it's very present, the racial wealth divide that we have. And the time and intention that we actually put into the work that we have and the tools we have available to us is critical. We can't address our current problems with the same solutions that we've applied in the past. We have to continue to push the edge. And so that's where, for me, it's a bit personal. I've had the opportunity as well to work in our local government here in the city and help advise other cities around the country, as well as some time in New York City, and really seeing this pathway of how we go about small business development as an industry. This is an exciting time in our country because there is this greater embracing now of how capital needs to look different, how it needs to operate different in our communities, whether it's equity and patient capital, to think in different ways about how we deploy more dollars into our communities, to even the expansion of what business looks like. The fact that we're talking about employee ownership right now. We couldn't have imagined this 10 years ago. And so it's just a wonderful time right now and a timely one. And I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you. So Carla, let's bring you in. You're the Chief Equity Officer in Fairfax County, which is a new-ish role. You've been doing it for a bit. But talk a little bit about what that means and why that role exists and why it's important in Fairfax County to do what you call advancing inclusive prosperity. And also, if you could share a little bit about why you're doing this work from a personal perspective, that would be great to hear.
Great, thank you for having me. So it is a new role. I've been in the role for just about a year and a half, but I will say I'm a part of a growing network of chief equity officers across the country. So while it's new work, I think it's work that's sort of beginning to expand and hopefully will eventually come to scale where we're not such a small group of folks. But I think it's important to take a step back. So I came to Fairfax County 20 years ago. In fact, I celebrated my 20th anniversary working for Fairfax County back just in September. And my background is in human services. And I worked in Fairfax County for 20 years and had about 5 years before that working in the field of human services and working among a group of people that were probably the most hardworking people you could ever work with, right? They saw need in a community and in their particular discipline worked very, very hard to address that need in community. But we kept working, we continue to work in our same circles, and sadly, with the same families, generationally, right? So there's a nonprofit that we work with in Fairfax County that talks about being able to see 3 generations of families stand in line waiting for food, right? Wow. And so it begins to paint a picture to you that there's something wrong here, right? Because no matter how hard we work, right? No matter how hard we work, no matter how hard the individuals and the families are working, there's a persistence that's happening that we're not overcoming. And so we had to take a step back and recognize that, one, we had to think more broadly than human services and our other partners, education, right? So this is a bigger issue than just the work of human services. And that there are things in the institution, there are things in the structure in the places where people live and then how those places are created institutionally that need to be addressed in order to affect outcomes for people. And so it was sort of with that aha that Fairfax embarked on an effort that we have coined as One Fairfax. And One Fairfax is a policy adopted jointly by our County Board of Supervisors and our school board that says that we will consider equity in all of our planning and decision making across the full expanse of government, across the full expanse of our school system, and that we will recognize as the two major systems and governing bodies in the jurisdiction. We will do that together, and we will do it collectively with our community. And so to lead that work, there needed to be someone, because again, that was a big goal, a big vision, but we needed to sort of have a focus and a structure and support for it, and that's how the role of the Chief Equity Officer evolved. But to do that work and to sort of tie together the work of discrete functions of the government, so again, from human services to public safety, to land use, to any other function, tax administration, right? Every function of government, to center a focus on One Fairfax has been the challenge of this role. And the way we've done that is to think about, well, what's driving the inequity that we're seeing, right? So we've really identified it in 5 key elements. Cradle to career success. So we want to ensure from birth to the point at which an individual transitions successfully into a career that can sustain them and sustain their family. We have to have a pathway and a system of supports. We also want to focus on being a community that's healthy, physically healthy, emotionally healthy, and that fosters the conditions of well-being. We want to focus on justice, a justice system that works for everyone, and a community as well that's safe. We want to focus on how we're developing our community, so having a range of housing options in different levels of affordability, as well as what are the assets and the features in communities that make them good places to live. But we think all of those things tie together toward a notion of inclusive prosperity, because again, all of those things sort of is a calculation. If we can ensure all of those things, then people are more likely to be able to participate in Fairfax County's economy. So I think it's important to acknowledge Fairfax County has a strong economy, right? And we want for Fairfax County to continue to have a strong economy. But as we look at our population and recognize that it's diversifying and that the income gap is growing and is continuing to grow, that, as you said, you can't keep doing the same things, right? You got to think differently about how we're approaching and how we're interpreting success. And so what we have tried to do in terms of One Fairfax is center our work on the economy, again, but to make it our success not just about a strong economy, but one that's more inclusive and one that's more resilient. And again, I think it's, I'll leave it there, but I think that while there are many moral reasons that we want to be One Fairfax, we have to understand that, our theme for One Fairfax is we all do better when we all do better, right? So we have to have people understand that there is, it's not about these people or those people or me and what I might lose. It is how, if we can invest in success for our whole population, then our whole population does better.
That's great.
Thank you. I think that's a really nice way of, from your personal story, of exemplifying Marjorie's point about barnacles on a whale, and that, like, from the human services perspective, you're not getting at the core of what's in the economy that we really need to change. So that's a great story. So one more thing to give Harold and Carla a chance to talk about, since this work is so deeply rooted in place. Any sort of one fact or thing about your community, about DC or about Fairfax, that you think the group should understand as you think about how you do this work? Harold, this is your cue to talk about co-ops in DC.
Yeah. There you go. Thanks for that, Ali.
I saw that look in your face.
Yeah.
The softball's getting to move slower.
That's right. That's a critical point. And so much of this discussion is really a renaissance. Because one of the things that we've we're keen on here in the region, and I'm looking directly at Jennifer because she has helped really to elevate this for us, to understand that the strategies that we're putting forward, they're not necessarily new, even though they feel very new. Like DC has a history, a long history, specifically with cooperative work, worker ownership, and really having that be a tool for which people can participate in our economy. And that's what we're talking about. A democratic economy is just creating pathways for people to fully participate, to be full citizens. That's what we're talking about. And so a couple of examples, let me grab my notes here. Capital Cab Company, that's a historic company in Washington, D.C. That was at one time one of the biggest taxi companies in the world. There were 1,500 taxis. It was cooperatively owned. Nanny Helen Burroughs, one of the famous corridors, commercial corridors in our city, was actually named after Nanny Helen Burroughs, who created Cooperative Industries of DC. Over 5 years, they served over 6,000 families. Wood production, canned food, they made clothing. It was a viable business. And so when you begin thinking about the strategies that we're employing now, we're hearkening back, we're getting guidance, we're looking to our history to understand pathways that can help us think now in a more dynamic way, because we know that it's been done before. We know that it's been tried and proven as a viable business model. And that's where we come into this discussion, right? Is how do you create pathways that are accessible, but that for us as an institution, we can bring our full skill sets and the full tools that we have available to make sure that we can, that there are successful strategies. So thank you for that, Joyce, because it's important for us to steep the work that we're doing, even though we're moving forward, that we steep it in some of the history that we do have as a region.
Carla, anything you want to share about Fairfax County that you think people should know, or that's?
Yeah, no, I think it's important to think about place. And when we talk about our Fairfax County strategy in its most basic term, it's about people, it's about place, and it's about power.
Yeah.
So from a place perspective, so Fairfax County, if you're not familiar, is a large suburban area just outside of the district. We have a population of 1.2 million people, and I always forget the actual square miles, but I know for sure that it's larger than the state of Rhode Island. I know that. And so it's a big place. And so depending on who you are and where you are in Fairfax, you might have a different life experience. And so we've been fortunate in our journey that as we've been on this path toward becoming One Fairfax, again, this is good timing because there are a lot of people that are having this aha moment at the same time. So we were supported in some research back in 2015 by PolicyLink and the University of Southern California. And what they did for us is an equitable growth profile. And it identified some key demographic statistics for Fairfax County, and it predicted that by this coming year will be a majority minority community. But the other thing that it did is it tied that change in our demographic to our economy, and it basically said that if people of color weren't sort of participating in our economy fully, sort of earning at their sort of maximum potential, then in the next 10, 20 years, as we think about our future, then sort of the Fairfax County that we know is not insured, right? And so it led us to think about, okay, so if that's the population that is not fully participating in our economy, where are they? And so another study that was done, this one was done by Virginia Commonwealth University with support from the Northern Virginia Health Foundation, looked at the uneven opportunity landscape. And it coined a term called islands of disadvantage. So amongst all the areas of wealth and prosperity in Fairfax County, there are these geographic areas that are predictable. So when you look at every indicator of life success and you look at where the people in the places that aren't faring as well, these areas pop up over and over again. So from an education perspective, from an employment perspective, from a health perspective. So it gave us a focus on the population, but also the places where people live. And so it's really given us sort of a North Star. And our North Star is we want to convert those areas that are now islands of disadvantage to communities of opportunity. So place matters, right? Because place is the primary vehicle for accessing opportunity, right? And so we don't want it to be predictable by place or population, your chance at success in Fairfax County.
Great. So Marjorie mentioned that the book is really organized around a set of principles. What are the first principles for this new economy? And so I wanted to dig into a little bit about how those principles play out in practice. And Harold, I'm going to come back to you first. So you work with small businesses. And sometimes when we have macro conversations where we talk about how do we improve job quality or how do we address issues of sustainability and the challenges facing our climate, we hear like asking businesses to solve this problem is too hard. It's going to make them uncompetitive. It's going to drive them out of business. What I'd love to hear is when you're having conversations with the small businesses you work with, what's their response, or how do they come to those questions of what's our role in terms of job quality, our role in terms of sustainability, and how do you work with them at WAKEF on that?
Sure, and that's a very fair question, because we actually do get that a lot, specifically when you're thinking of new ways of operating that might be out of a traditional sort of business mindset. There's a couple of things that work to our advantage. One, I think, is that many of the companies that we work with, and I'll bring it to the person instead of the company, right? The business owners, the entrepreneurs, they're steeped in the communities that we're working in. And so there's a certain level of values that we're able to have an appeal towards, because what we know is that the small businesses we work with, they're the ones that are hiring locally. They're caring about the youth. And so they invest in different ways that aren't always quantifiable. They serve as community anchors. They're anchors for jobs. And the through line in all of that is there's values associated to how our entrepreneurs are operating their businesses. And so coming from that vantage point, I think is one anchoring factor that allows us to begin having discussions about broader impact. What does business growth look like for you? What type of asset are you actually creating? Because truth be told, we do have critical issues that are all throughout the region. And the thing that's not unique about Fairfax of all the special things is that the racial wealth divide and the other inequality issues that we're dealing with is throughout our region. And so when you begin to think about how our businesses are positioned, in part, a lot of the people that we're working with, they're also focused on creating opportunities for their own households and for themselves. And so it's a careful balance that we have to achieve. So specifically when we begin thinking about whether it is sustainability or employee ownership, often it's a discussion in values. Specifically with employee ownership, one value point is actually the brand that person has poured their heart and soul into creating. Whatever the business, whether it's a new approach or whether it's something that's in a competitive environment, the ability to create an asset is difficult. Hands down. Any business owner that tell you the creation of their company was easy is probably not that successful. Because it's your life, you know, and so having a discussion about how you turn over ownership or expand ownership to that company that you've built, it's a difficult proposition. But that's what makes discussions around succession planning, discussions around the brand living beyond you, the brand being bigger than you, because it means so much more to the people that in the community that see that brand. And so all of that was to say, part of what our articulation has been, specifically with introducing employee ownership to companies and different approaches, it's been, how do we preserve your legacy? How do we continue the asset that you've created? And we also know we want to get to that point of retiring at some point for all of us, right? And so we've really used that pathway of engaging our businesses.
Great, great. So Carly, you talked about the differing places and how opportunity differs in different places. Can you give us some examples of when it gets to policies, actual policies or programs or projects that the county's working on, how that plays out and how you're working to address that?
Absolutely. So I talked about the sort of 5 equity drivers, and really those are unifying, because then you can sort of use those drivers to tie all the various actions and functions of government together so that everybody can sort of see the ultimate results we're working toward. And so 2 things that we've done where I've seen this unifying work, both across the county government and the school system, as well as with the county government and our community, are around housing affordability and childcare. So as we've identified sort of what we want to work on, those are 2 issues that sort of popped up to the top. Sort of they were unifying across, sort of many different groups as sort of the key issue. If we could solve one key issue, and solve is a term I've used loosely, address one key issue, what were they? So repeatedly, those things came up. So those are 2 areas where we are making greater investments, looking differently at sort of how we utilize our own resources from our own assets, our own land, our own buildings, and sort of leveraging them for the benefit of achieving different outcomes. It's also an area where I think we are sort of what tied us originally to the Democracy Collaborative, and it was recognizing our role as an anchor, right? In sort of our spend, and sort of what we're spending our resources on, and who we're spending our resources to serve, and who we're spending our resources with. And so, those 2 policy areas sort of underlying that are also areas for producing this notion of inclusive prosperity. I will say, though, that as we sort of do this work on One Fairfax and recognize that we can be working collectively within the government and with our school system and with our community, there are other drivers of outcomes that we also have to consider, and a lot of that is federal and state policy. And so, right now at the state level, one of the things that we're trying to tackle is the definition of best value. So we are governed by the Virginia procurement law, and Virginia procurement law defines best value as what's the best quality and what's the best cost, right? And what that doesn't allow, though, is for us to consider other socioeconomic factors and other inclusion factors that would be of value to our community. And so the advocacy at the state level to look at changing procurement law, I think, is going to be significant in terms of other things that we'd like to explore doing. So policy, again, One Fairfax has been something, we adopted that policy in November of 2017. The term was coined in 2014 or 2015. We've talked about it, we've embraced it, but it won't become a reality until we can take action. And those actions have to be supported by policy. So again, focusing our policies in the areas that we think will have the greatest impact on the individuals and families that are most vulnerable in our community, but also acknowledging where we see barriers to the policies we would like to take and addressing those as well.
Great. So Marjorie, let's bring you back in.
Yeah, I just want to say I really love everything that I'm hearing. It's so wonderful to write a book and you're taking these sort of big views and then you come down and it's like, it's exactly here. It's what's happening. So let me just offer a couple of comments. So Carla, I think you recognizing that Fairfax County is an anchor, that is so powerful. And if I could sort of zoom up again to a larger scale, we've been doing some work at the Democracy Collaborative in Preston, England, which is kind of a Rust Belt city in northern England, very similar to Cleveland, where we've done some work. And they used government as an anchor. They had the county, they had the schools, they had actually the pension fund. Buying locally, they shifted hundreds of millions of pounds of purchasing into the local county. They had the pension fund doing some investing locally. They were actually able to move the needle on unemployment and poverty in this city, and with some demonstrable results. And in fact, PricewaterhouseCoopers named Preston the most improved city in the UK. Because of this work with anchors. Wow. So these are large levers, and this is, when we talk about the role of assets it's not just money. It's like all communities have
That's right.
assets
That's right.
that we can. Carla was talking about all the assets that we have, and can we use those to benefit our local communities? Investing, purchasing, hiring, the skills of youth. I mean, there's all kinds of assets that we have. If we can keep them local and use them, we can really move the needle. I think
right.
on community benefit. So that's is such an exciting story of what you're doing. And let me just add. Harold, I'm tremendously excited about your work also. You're talking about business owners, they want to preserve their legacy, and can we transition to employee ownership? And this is an issue that is up for our society right now. There are 2.34 million businesses owned by baby boom entrepreneurs. That something is going to happen to those businesses in the next 10 years. If past trends hold, 90% of them will close. Very few that are not that many are put on the market. Those that are generally do not sell. These are viable businesses, many of them. And could they be transitioned to employee ownership? Does capital have a role to play in that? I mean, I think those are the things that you have your hands on locally here in DC. And I think that there's a substantial opportunity, and particularly if you're looking at businesses that employ maybe half or more people of color. That's a particular way to benefit those communities. So there's some very large, so I want to just point out these two issues, the role of anchors, the role of what's been called the silver tsunami, all these businesses coming on the market. There are large forces that we can work with to build the democratic economy. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about here.
Great, thank you. So how do we, thinking about, you've started to get us there, Marjorie, which is great. We had some great examples of how this plays out on the ground, this concept of building a democratic economy. What does it take to move to an economic system, which is a democratic economy? So let's touch on that a little bit. Carla, you mentioned at the beginning that you're not the only chief equity officer out there, that there are other communities that are using this model. And talk a little bit about how you're engaged with others nationally who are doing this kind of work and how you're learning from each other and trying to build this work.
Yeah, so earlier as I was telling sort of the story of my shift in focus in career as well as the shift in focus for Fairfax County, I made a very long story short. And part of the detail of that story is that when we began to have the aha moment that our issues couldn't be addressed at the individual level and just at the person level, but we had to elevate and consider more sort of institutionally and structurally how we needed to foster change. We started to look at what was happening across the country, and we came across an organization called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And they formed probably right at about the same time as we were sort of coming into this new awareness. And it was a group of folks who had been doing this work mainly on the West Coast, in Oregon and in Washington State, but sort of recognizing that, again, to bring this to scale, we really had to think not just about our own local communities, but just nationally, sort of how they could support others. And so right now, I think at last count, there is a network of, I think, 170 jurisdictions across the country who at least have membership with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And I'm not sure specifically how many of those particular jurisdictions have chief equity officers, but I will say that having a chief equity officer, and I should mention that sort of how I'm situated in our organization matters, is that I work on the team of the county executive, right? So in his office, working with executive leadership and our elected leadership to devise our strategy around advancing opportunity in Fairfax County. But depending on the jurisdiction, folks do it differently, right? So I think local context is important, but as we talk about, we're a urban, suburban community. And given the way our government is structured, a chief equity officer placed the way I am makes sense. But as you look at these jurisdictions across the country, while they've embraced a focus on achieving equity, they've done it in many, many different ways. But I will say that there is a common sort of framework for effective practice It's normalizing, and specifically normalizing conversations about race.
That's
So
right.
we haven't talked about that much on the panel, but when you talk about who is not faring as well, predictably, you can predict it by race. You have to normalize sort of conversations about our history, right? So we inherited a system, right? So we can continue to perpetuate the existing system, or we can do something different, but we have to acknowledge the history. So normalizing, organizing within organization and in organizations and across organizations, but ultimately getting to results through operationalizing. And so that same basic framework is the framework that they established from the effective work that was happening in the jurisdictions out west, and it's now being brought to scale nationally through the Government Alliance on Race and Equity.
Okay. Fantastic.
If I can add to that,
Absolutely.
Joyce, really quickly, and that's a wonderful point, because I think it's, when you begin to think about not only our government institutions, and it's wonderful that that step has been taken, and you think about the other, taken to create a chief equity officer, and what you're leading, Carla, as you begin to think about the other levers, right? Because it's not just government. As we begin to think about capital, as we begin to think about the other pillars that are pathways for folks to pursue economic opportunity, it's important that when we're having discussions about equity, that we're specific. Just to call back to that point, we have definitive issues in Washington, D.C., just as one example of one area that's in this region, where definitively, when you're talking about poor neighborhoods, it's Black and brown communities. And if we're not only comfortable, but also intentional in how we're directing our resources, how we're directing the solutions that we're putting forward in those communities, then we're going to miss the mark.
That's right.
Because we'll have discussions about a diverse economy, an inclusive economy, but it won't be filled with the issues that are of our day, that are steeped in this country's history. And so we have to be intentional when in DC, there's a 81x difference between Black households and white households.
Wow.
That's an issue. And so for us as an organization, that was a part of the shift that we made in how we leverage capital. 80% of our portfolio is to entrepreneurs of color. Last year, all of our lending went to entrepreneurs of color. 50% of our lending went to women entrepreneurs. There has to be intention tied to direction and how it is that we're moving forward solutions.
Yeah, Marjorie.
So something is coming to mind for me, Joyce, and that is one of the people we interview in the book is some people doing racial equity work in Portland, Oregon. And they've been doing some remarkable work trying to reorient the entire economic development division of Portland around racial and gender equity. And it's a very, very powerful story. And one of these wonderful executives said to me, she said, you know, when you have, now Portland, Oregon has a lot of people of color who are not doing well. That's not what we normally think of Portland. But she said, if you have half of your body is not doing well, is not functioning well, you don't have a healthy body.
That's right.
You know? So if you have half of Portland or half of DC or half of Fairfax County that's just not functioning, it can't repair a car or put a kid through school, you don't have a healthy community. So I think it's this notion of inclusion is just absolutely core.
And just to come to that, you know, in some of the work that we've been doing on business ownership and particularly looking at it from a racial equity lens, I think the other thing to think about is, Marjorie, you pointed out the silver tsunami of people retiring. And one of the things we see in communities that are struggling economically is that the rates of firm deaths are higher than the rates of new formation. And we see that levels of entrepreneurship are declining generally in many places. So if you combine that with the demographic shift, that means more and more of the people who are going to be looking to start and grow businesses are people of color. And those are the people who have faced the greatest barriers. If we don't confront that, we're going to have an issue with who's creating the businesses, who's growing the businesses, and are they getting the resources that they need to sort of build our economy from that perspective. So thank you for highlighting that. I'm going to do one quick lightning round, but then I'm going to open for questions. So for those of you who have questions, get them ready. I want to talk a little bit, Carla, you started the conversation a bit about policy, but since we're sitting in a policy program here, we like to have the policy conversation. What's at least one policy that you'd like to see change that could really support the growth of a more democratic economy? Marjorie, you ready?
Okay. Sure. I do think that supporting the growth of employee ownership, the time is now, the need is now. I think it could be huge. That we can have state centers of employee ownership. We could have city centers of employee ownership. We could have federal funding for those, or for an employee ownership bank. These are some of the ideas that have been floated. In fact, that one proposal that I've seen is for even loan guarantees. So you don't even have, government doesn't even have to provide the capital, but could attract private capital with loan guarantees, which could be piloted at a small or a large level.
Speaking my language, Marjorie.
That's great.
I mean, just to reiterate what I shared earlier, at this particular moment for Fairfax County, I think that definition of best value is going to be, if not the answer to everything, is really going to open up, again, not to overuse the term opportunity, but it's just going to allow us to explore new things, because often policy sets in the way of the good ideas that we would like to explore, and we get afraid of it. Just the fact that we're willing to put it on our legislative agenda is a big deal for us, and so we're really excited about the actions of the General Assembly.
Great. Harold?
Yeah, I think I'll rattle off a couple, Joyce. I won't quite follow direction there, but I think particularly when you look at, from a couple different angles, the Community Reinvestment Act, specifically the parameters around our financial institutions, ensuring that not only support is there to help lift up this work, but also that as we think about how lending is done, as we think about how capital is deployed, that there's stronger frameworks to ensure that our banking institutions are investing in our communities. CDFIs as a whole are a rounding error in terms of the assets that are under management, and there's some pretty significant CDFIs that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars of assets under management. And so that's just one area. But transitioning to local, as you begin to think about, for any of you that are in government or have an opportunity to influence government, procurement is a great place to start, just to reiterate that. Specifically, policies that are focused intentionally with the problems that you have in your areas. And so specifically an MWBE focus, a focus on minority set-aside programs. They're critical. Also licensing. I had the opportunity to be the licensing administrator here in DC. As you begin to think about barriers to opportunities, much of our licensing infrastructure is draconian. And so at the city, state, county levels, I would look at all of those different areas of barriers to access to opportunity. And of course, if there are ways to put more capital into CDFIs, that's always a wonderful place to focus.
Great, thank you. Terrific, great policy ideas. So we're gonna open up for questions here. A few things I wanna note. For folks who are joining by live stream, if you tweet a question to our Talk Opportunity hashtag, we can maybe queue it up. Our team here will be monitoring Twitter. And so if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll ask someone with the mic to come to you. One thing I wanted to point out also, just as we go into the questions, for our panel today, we wanted to lift up local DC area examples, but I also happen to know that our Community Strategies group, which is one of our policy programs here at the Aspen Institute, has a group who's meeting today and who's in the audience, because I see some of their faces. And they're the Rural Development Innovators group, and they are from rural communities in the US who are using many of these strategies. So they're focusing on community wealth building, they're focusing on inclusion, they're focusing on entrepreneurship, they're focusing on issues of sustainability, which we didn't touch on as much today, but clearly a critical piece. So if any of you all, I'll just invite you into the conversation if you want to share a little bit about what you're doing, we'd love to hear that, but also love to hear questions from the group. So yes, gentleman right here.
I'm John Coonrod, and I coordinate the movement for community-led development, which is outside the U.S. mostly. But I'm fascinated by the opportunity of the Virginia legislature. And my wife used to work for the Virginia legislature. So is there sort of a set of norms or what exactly would that procurement reform look like? Would it be, there would be this point system for minority employee-owned local organizations, or how would that work so that we can all write, everybody in Virginia can write in and get that to happen?
Okay.
So again, the devil's in the details, right? So the first step is to get the law changed. I will say, though, that part of the benefit of being connected to an organization like the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, or there are jurisdictions across the country who have embedded those practices.
Yeah.
So that is a challenge because, again, we all do better when we all do better. We don't want to shift from one. So there's a scarcity notion that we want to, we have to overcome. It's about broadening the pot and expanding the pot, not sort of limiting who has access to it. So we do want to be careful in our approach, but our strategies are going to be to look at how other jurisdictions have done it successfully. But right now, our focus is on getting the law changed.
If I can offer a couple things here too, because there are a number of cities that are grappling with this exact same topic. And so I had the pleasure of serving as the small business director in DC as well. So we grapple with a lot of those topics. So first, intentionality around minority inclusion and there being preference tied to it. That's first and foremost. I think second, the capital programs that are actually tied to opportunity programs. Often what you have is a gap. You create a lot of contracting opportunities, but not the capital so that those companies can actually be successful in going after those opportunities. Lines of credit are important. Government will not pay on time. I'm not sure if that policy approach will account for the time at which a company is paid, but that's a very real issue. If you can't pay your payroll, it's problematic. But also specifically to procurement unbundling. You have to ensure that if it's a desire to target small businesses, that opportunities align with the capacity of the small businesses that are part of your community. So those are just a couple areas that, when it's a procurement regime that we're talking about, policies that are supportive of small business and intentional about minority businesses.
Okay, this woman here.
Hi, my name's Patty Rose, and I run a small nonprofit in DC called Green Space, and we work on sustainability, but that's not actually the focus of my question. I've been taking a strong look at this whole approach of collective impact, and it seems that all of what you're talking about really lends itself to a more collaborative and data-driven, accountable approach. And one of the challenges I know, at least in this region, is we don't have a really deep pocket in terms of the foundations that are here to support that kind of work. And if you're familiar with that and you were interested in it, how might you approach it? Because it seems like you go after certain initiatives, but you don't have the follow-up of how to integrate it into common practice, and you don't have the data to follow up of what the impact is and whether it's working in the longer term.
So I would say that, collective impact, while I may not have used that particular term, is sort of one of those sort of foundational concepts for how we're organizing our work around One Fairfax, particularly on this shared agenda piece, right? So recognizing that we have a shared interest in the success, in sort of, we're all, basically cogs on a wheel, right? We're moving in that direction. We have to recognize our unique roles in advancing this, our efforts toward achieving the broader goal. But also around this whole mutually reinforcing activities, is I think what they call it. So I think that there's a lot of disparate work that happens, but not a lot of effort to sort of help people to tie it. So I will say that that's a role that Fairfax County government is stepping into. It's also a role that we fund in some of our nonprofits in our community, recognizing that there is value in that role. And I will say that as we have been doing more work in the space of advancing racial and social equity, we have been doing it in conjunction with a lot of our philanthropic partners in this area. And I think that there is a growing recognition amongst that group of the need for us to work in intersecting collective ways and the need to work with government to leverage government as a resource, but also to affect policy change ultimately. So I think that those principles give us a good framework in terms of sort of how it gets implemented in practice. I think that's sort of unique to particular communities, but I think as long as you sort of figure out the best ways to support those respective functions, again, government is playing roles that what some might call in that traditional backbone type function. We're funding those roles in other cases, so I think that those principles are definitely ones that are beneficial as a way of, as I said, organizing.
Only small thing I would add is I think there needs to be greater translation that takes place. That I think there's a core set of values when you have people who are public servants who are committed to having impact, right? And often that's forgotten. And I think the time frame and the urgency at which most governments have to operate, whether it's city, county, state, federal, is different than folks that are outside of government. And so I think the ability to translate what it is you're looking to do in a translatable way so that it's understood more quickly as a viable solution that meets whether it's that foundation or that government's ultimate goals of where they're going. The burden is often on those of us outside of government to make that effort. There's a reason why our initiative in DC is the Employee Ownership Initiative. Very easy to understand. Because one of the things we found early was that worker-owned cooperatives, having that as a central focal point, it became a barrier because we were trying to translate, and DC has a long history of cooperatives, and so it for us it was how do we translate in the easiest way a solution that everyone wants in terms of creating new pathways to entrepreneurship. And so it's a very small example, but I would just complement that with what Carla mentioned as well. Values are often aligned, but that translation sometimes becomes a barrier.
Got a question here?
Hello, my name is Dennis Olson. I work for the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, and I've been representing UFCW in the Good Food Purchasing Policy Coalition for the DC area. And so that is based on a program that was developed over 5 years ago in Los Angeles by the Food Policy Council there. And it's a procurement policy mainly targeted, it's expanding to other public institutions, but it's mostly been focused on public school districts. And it has 5 sustainability categories, including a valued workforce that makes having a union contract one of the highest scores. It's a scoring system. And then also worker-owned cooperatives is another high score. And then local economy, environmental sustainability, animal welfare, and nutrition. So that has now, in the past 6 years, been passed by over a dozen various city institutions across the country. And one of the big obstacles we've run into gets to this best value question, which is the lack of transparency in the procurement policy and in the bidding process and the selection process. So I guess 2 questions. Have you guys heard about the Good Food Purchasing Policy? Or are you looking at that because it does have a pretty good track record. It's coming from the ground up, from the city level up, but we're running into these issues that you're talking about with best value at both the state and the federal level. The school lunch, the federal school lunch program is totally opaque as far as being able to tell what those supply chains look like. So I just wondered if you had heard about that and whether you have any responses to that.
Not specifically that, but food is one particular area that we are looking at. And I will say that as we talk about implementation, transparency is important because we have to be clear for our own purposes how we're defining this sort of new definition of best value and the criteria that are established for ourselves as well as for those on the outside to better understand. So I will definitely look into and share with the folks that are working directly on this initiative that specific example, but I would just reinforce that transparency is key.
That's great. Thank you. That's a great example, Shank. Thank you for sharing that. I see a question here, blue shirt, and then I see the person in front of you as well. Thank you.
Mr. Pettigrew, recently, Shaquille O'Neal said that he would encourage the creation of Papa John's franchises at historically black colleges and universities. The issue with that is that franchises are a double-edged sword. They are a route for entrepreneurship, but they're controlled mainly by multinational corporations that often work against the interests of workers. Have you thought about ways that the franchise model can be reformed or changed so that, or can it be changed in a way so that the benefits of franchising as a pathway to entrepreneurship isn't always followed by the adverse impacts that it can have on workers, and the fact that often even the franchisees are victims of an extractive economic model?
Yeah, so I think the short answer specifically to those multinationals, no, I haven't thought about that, because that's well beyond my influence locally. But I think the broader underpinning of your question, I think a proper response is, one of the things that we focused on is how do you expose entrepreneurship in much greater ways to like the ecosystem that's here? Because part of it is folks just want to pursue entrepreneurship. It's not necessarily, at least I've never come across it, people necessarily want to start a franchise. It's an opportunity, and for some it might be a viable opportunity. We actually have companies we work with locally that have franchised their business model with a set of values, though, that are embedded in how they've operated as a business owner. And so to me, how we've addressed that, and not directly, but I think indirectly, is the promotion of the power of entrepreneurship. And I often say that because we think there is a value, of course, that's there to get to our ultimate mission of creating greater opportunities. So that's the only way that I would respond. But if someone wants to start, there's been plenty of successful business owners that have started, and I won't name any specific franchises, but that have launched major franchises. And through that have been community anchors and for jobs and everything else. And so I just think if we're able to, not only our organization, but our ecosystems are focused on how do you reduce barriers to entrepreneurship and expose more examples of what successful entrepreneurship looks like locally, then it'll get at that exact issue.
Anyone else on the panel want to speak to that?
Well, one of the ideas that we've explored at the Democracy Collaborative is, if you do have franchising, could you make employee ownership part of that? It's an idea, and we'll see if it has legs.
Okay, great, thank you. Question here?
Hi, Jeff Schwartz with the Appalachian Regional Commission. I have a two-part question for you. Are there any particular types of companies that are better or worse suited for employer ownership? And what would be the right mix in an economy, a metro economy such as DC? How much would you want to have employer ownership, and how much would be too much?
Yeah, I'll kind of kick off. For me, what's important is that there's a healthy economy of entrepreneurship. We've often had these, I've had these discussions nationally, right, about folks who are looking to drive ecosystems that are supportive of employee ownership. That's great, because that work needs to happen, because there's not enough opportunity or pathways to employee ownership at present. Employee ownership is not going to be good for everyone. Just like small business ownership isn't good for everyone, right? And so I think having a healthy mix is important. DC's economy is heavily service-based, and we're having growing examples where service-based companies are an increasingly great example of why employee ownership is actually a great pathway. And so I don't know that there's a right answer about like what the right mix is, but I think we have to embrace it as an opportunity that we're helping to facilitate where people are. So I would hate to be prescriptive in that way to a certain industry or for certain folks. For us, embracing it as an organization, it's one of the tools in the toolkit, so to say, but not the only tool. Yeah, so that would be my response to that.
I also, Marjorie, I wonder if you could get in here, because I think one thing that also might be useful is to talk about the breadth of forms of employee ownership that can work at differently maybe in different industries and different sizes of.
Yeah, that's right. So you have worker co-ops, which in the U.S. tend to be smaller, average about 9 people, although in Spain they're quite large industrial companies. So worker co-op is 1 share, 1 vote. Every employee has an equal say and equal share. Then there are also what are called ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans. And this is, there are significant tax advantages for companies that put employee ownership into an ESOP. And these can be quite large companies. For example, one that we've worked with is Recology in the Bay Area. It's $1.2 billion in revenue. It's 100% owned by employees. And it's a place where garbage collectors can make $100,000. I always like to say that. Because if you're not extracting as much for capital, there's more to go around for workers. So it can work at different scales. So the question that you ask is, what would be the right mix? I don't think we know yet, but I think that when I say we, I mean we as a society don't know yet. But we certainly, as in the U.S., had a major commitment to broad-based home ownership in the post-war era, and we achieved 66%. I think about 60. Probably not much more than that would be feasible. So could you get that high with employee ownership? Maybe you could. I don't know. I think it remains to be seen. But Harold is quite right that it's not right for every business. You don't want to put every business in this mold. There are a lot of craft beer companies that are transitioning to employee ownership. A lot of consulting firms, I think service firms, where the main skills and knowledge is the asset of the firm, and it would make sense that employees would own that asset because it basically is the knowledge in their head. But there are some that I think probably wouldn't work. Those that have very high capital needs, for example. One of the businesses that we've worked pretty closely with is Cape Air. And that's an airline on Cape Cod, and they're 30% employee-owned. And the CEO says to me, we couldn't go much more than 30% because we need a lot of capital, and they need to be able to sell equity in order to get that kind of capital. So I think we're at a point as a community looking for those rules of thumb. Where does it work? Where does it not work?
Right. But there are some major companies that through ESOPs and that kind of do have structures. So we've also done panels where we've had, I think, Amstead Industries, which is a big manufacturing firm. Wawa is an employee-owned company. There are large companies that people know of. Yeah. So that helps to broaden your lens of how that might look. Yes, Grady.
Grady Hedgespath, the Consumer Bureau. I'm fascinated by this history, and if you don't know your history, you might actually repeat it. So what happened to this 1,500 cab company?
Yeah.
And what does that say about the governmental structures or what might have contributed to them not being here anymore?
Yeah, we're still exploring because it's difficult to find history on what actually happened. And we're talking about the 30s through the 60s, where the ability to get that kind of information hasn't quite materialized. And so a couple factors just in my own history and knowing how things have evolved here. When you think about the evolution of the taxi company and the medallion system and those sort of things, there's been different factors introduced that we probably can pinpoint from the 60s to now that had a disrupting factor there. The important thing here is to mention that at that period as well, these business models were pursued because, quite frankly, African American families were blocked out legally from pursuing different business opportunities. And so as we progressed as a society, it created more openness to be able to pursue outside of the traditional, those means that have been set up, more broader opportunities, whether it was jobs or business creation. Like one of the things that we've been having a lot of internal discussions about as well is that even when you look at the notions of like redlining that impacted housing, the same thing happened with business ownership. And so people created businesses because they couldn't in many different ways. And so as we progress again as a society and reduce those barriers, a lot of Black-owned companies that were in certain neighborhoods and different areas went away because there were greater opportunities. So I would imagine that those are different factors that were associated. But we're doing some focus to not only think through the ecosystem, but also think through how we can really elevate in a much more specific way the legacy of those companies.
If I could just quickly add on the history piece, I think it is very significant. I mean, our One Fairfax strategy is a very forward-focused strategy, but in order to not repeat the mistakes of the past, we have to look backwards and figure out why this came to be. I mean, we have in our process are really trying to institutionalize the root cause analysis. But why? But why? But why? And so as we look to unearth this history, one of the things is the same thing. That part of history isn't well documented because generally speaking, the winners get to document the history, right? So whoever were the particular winners at any given time, they get to say what happened. And so it's really important that we capture this story. I was at a meeting yesterday with a local pastor, and as I was waiting to meet with him, I had the opportunity to talk to his receptionist, and she told me, 5 minutes worth of valuable Fairfax housing land use policy history from her life experience that really I can now sort of think about more broadly about, well, if this happened to her family, what about families in this entire area? And so I think it's really important that we invest time and energy to better understand that history because, again, it provides us a real, at least for the local government, it provides us real documentation of the evidence of government's role in producing what we see today. But it also helps us to, better understand how we can stop producing harm. So,
and that we honor the history of
Absolutely.
what has happened, right? Like we've had people to survive and thrive and persevere under, in spite of, and it's okay getting to that point of comfort again, and it's our history. We have to embrace it if we're going to develop the right solutions moving forward. That we are intentional in talking about and understanding what has happened, so we understand why we're here today.
Great.
And again, there's an asset focus to that. This is my big passion. Because I think that while we focus on the gaps in our existing system, we also have to focus on the contributions in spite of.
That's right.
In spite of a structure in a system that was, in some cases, intentionally meant to separate people from opportunity. So as much as we want to better understand the gaps, we also have to understand the assets because I think that teaches us that it's possible, right? So, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question here.
Hello. Oh, hi. I'm Abby. I'm from the Department of Commerce, and I'm an intern, but I'm also a college student, so I haven't really started my career yet. So I just wanted to know what I can do to kind of help build this democratic economy for equal economic opportunity as like a regular citizen.
Well, that's a great question. I think follow your heart to where your skills are a natural fit. I began as a writer and have moved into consulting and now some management. So what are the skills that you want to bring? And then develop those and find the place that you have something to offer. It could be in government. It could be at a CDFI. It can be inside a bank. It could be inside a nonprofit. There's lots of places. But I think, paying attention to kind of what lights you up and where you think you have something to add. And thank you for the question, and good luck.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
We need you.
So I think we've got 3 minutes, and I see 3 questions. So I'm going to take the 3 questions and then give us a quick chance to answer them. So I'm going to start here.
Hi.
If you can do your question quickly, that'd be great too.
Okay, great. I'm Allison Powers from Capital Impact Partners. First of all, really quick, I wanted to say that there is a worker-owned franchise starting in New York City, the Center for Family Life. It's funded by Robin Hood, and they're doing home cleaning. They have about 4 or 5 right now. My question is, what can DC government do to encourage employee ownership?
Okay, great. There's a question right here. Actually, Renita.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry, I was wondering how a democratic economy and some of these shifts that you've been describing might help navigate technological and changes in automation and some inequities that potentially transpire there.
Great. And then last shot is to my esteemed colleague, Janet Topolsky.
I'll try to make this quick. I'm thinking about industrial commons, which is reviving sort of the textile industry in Western North Carolina through worker ownership, but also, and a network of small businesses that are reviving, as I said, textile manufacturing. But they're also working together collectively to go to zero waste, right? To have a closed system on the waste. And so my question to you has to do with, how are you thinking about these equity values in the development of the democratic economy in relation to other assets that are also important to equity? Because if you look at the effects of climate change, they disproportionately affect people of color and low-income people and people in poor communities. And so what about the practices of the companies?
Great. So who wants to take a shot? We got 1 minute,
Okay,
so we're going to be fast.
I'll just say real quickly, yes, the whole question of sort of an ecological transition, there's a lot of roles for ownership to play in that. It's not just employee ownership. It could be community ownership of land or municipal ownership of utilities. And I'll give a quick example. Right now in California, or maybe a week or two ago, if you had flown over California, you would have seen lots of blackouts where PG&E had blacked out its areas. And you would have found an area where the lights were on, and that is where they had a municipally owned utility, which was more responsible in the way it ran itself because it was owned by the people of the community and not about extracting wealth. So that's my answer. I'll toss to the others.
DC government.
Really
That's a
quickly
good
on
one.
DC government. Yeah, so I think first, examining all the barrier points. One, the law has to contemplate first what employee ownership actually is and worker-owned cooperatives so that folks cannot run into any barriers with creating a business. Second, with procurement programs, coming back, that's a favorite topic for today, thinking through set-aside incentives that can go towards companies that are employee-owned. It's a value point of the city. The mayor included it in her economic strategy, the first round. And so I think building on what the next set of solutions look like are going to be critical.
If I might, just to get in the last word, to address your issue about technological change, I think one of the things we see with employee ownership is when the employees are the owners, they may make different choices about whether and how they change jobs, invest in workers, and think about whether they do things like outsourcing. And so I think that's one way to think about how it connects to some of these principles.
That's great.
Anyone else want to add one last word on that?
I just want to bring up the sort of intersecting nature of sort of all the work. So again, the technological changes, the ecological impacts, we have to realize that, these are not discrete efforts, right? It's intersecting. And so the same pipelines that we're building to achieve equity have to be the same pipelines that will help us to transition to a more technologically focused community, that will help us to transition to better understand sort of our impact on our environment and ecosystem. So we have to make sure that we're not building separate pipelines and strategies, but that we're doing them collectively.
Fantastic.
Perfect answer.
I know.
That's right.
All right, good, thank you.
Great. Wow, that was a fantastic discussion. Thank you all so much. I want to remind you the book is available for sale, and I think Marjorie will be around for a little bit to sign books if you'd like. But thanks again to a great panel. I almost forgot to get up here because I'm taking notes and trying to read things and everything. This is a fabulous discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh, that was fun. That was good.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I know.